My skepticism, I'm sure, is very clear to all of you. To diplomatic breakthroughs, I'm going to give an A. Again, without firing a single shot or even deploying any troops, Nixon transformed the world balance of power in China and the regional balance of power in Egypt. And there were other opportunities for things like that, too. Very cost effective. For support for an insurgency, all I can give is a C. It did have a good effect in Afghanistan. In Angola and Mozambique, these wars killed large numbers of people, devastated the country, and really, I don't think any reasonable person could tell the difference between the two contenders. And I'm very sad the United States ever thought that we had to get mixed up in anything like that. Full-scale war, I already mentioned offensively, Grenada. That's about the only one. Of course, we tried it in North Korea, where it didn't work either. Now, lastly, the strategy of political and economic isolation, which we are still pursuing, of course, against Cuba. Now, one of my colleagues has suggested to me that I'm being too harsh because embargoes on enemy states can work to the advantage of friendly states. And there may be some truth to that. But as a weapon to bring down an unfriendly government, I think it's a complete failure, and I wish we would give it up. Now, once again, today, much of the world is threatened by an ideology, militant Islam, which is often hostile to the values and interests of the United States. And our response to that has been our major preoccupation for the last decade and will continue to be so for some time. Now, militant Islam, in my opinion, is not nearly as well organized as communist parties were, nor does it threaten such critical areas of the world. Remember, in 1946, there was a lot of worry about communism in Western Europe, too. Meanwhile, world population is way up, and the size of our military is way down compared to the Cold War. So I hope that this lecture has not only put Vietnam in context, but will get you thinking about what our various responses are, including diplomacy, to this new crisis, what the limits of our ability to effect political change in the Islamic world are, about the degree of freedom that we owe the other peoples of the world to determine their destiny, and above all, over whether we can or must win them all. Thank you. Although I have run a little over, I do want to encourage you to ask me any questions, not only about this, but if there's something about Vietnam that I have not covered, I'll be glad to take a crack at that. So, question time. Oh, AV, don't take the slide down. Could somebody go back to them and get that message through? Oh, good. Okay. Questions? Yes.
Tom Kelly from National Geospatial Intelligence Agency.
Yep.
I look forward to a seminar next week with you, Professor, and share our thoughts on President Reagan's impact on the fall of the Soviet Union.
Sure.
My question deals with India. Throughout the length and the breadth of the Cold War, all the maps you showed up there, it had India as neutral.
Yes.
As nominally as part of the non-aligned movement.
Yes.
India was pretty much an independent country. However, they did have a large amount of Soviet military equipment. They operated with the Soviet Navy in the Indian Ocean during the 80s. So why would you have them as neutral and not as a Soviet?
I thought about that, and India could have been colored like Egypt as a Soviet client, and maybe should have, but I only had time to open so many cans of worms, and that was one I just stayed away. But I think you have a perfectly legitimate point there. Yes. Actually, since you mentioned that, it's one of the tragedies of Vietnam I discovered. In the early 60s, India and Pakistan, which of course was also Bangladesh then, were having problems, and we were trying to mediate. And in the spring of '65, when we started bombing North Vietnam, the leaders of India, Shastri, and Pakistan, I think that was Ayub Khan, were both scheduled to come to the US and visit Johnson at the White House. And then we started bombing North Vietnam, and both of them attacked the bombing of North Vietnam. And Johnson canceled those visits, both of them. And later in 1965, war broke out between Pakistan and India. And actually, then the Soviets stepped in to mediate that war, and that was the beginning of the Soviet-Indian relationship. So that was part of the opportunity cost of Vietnam. But the basic answer to your question, Tom, is yes, you're right. Yep.
Colonel Spiegel, Seminar 7. Really great presentation about looking at these conflicts in the big picture over a large period of time, and it got me to thinking, it's often said that in Vietnam, the U.S. won every engagement but lost the battle. Looking at it from a perspective of Vietnam today, could you make an argument that we did not lose the battle, or did not lose the war?
Well, I don't agree with the argument that we won any engagement. The vast majority of engagements in Vietnam were small unit engagements, which could reasonably be described as stalemates. In big battles, we inflicted much heavier casualties, yes, but that's for another time. However, yes, you are absolutely right, and in fact, what is really extraordinary is that people who spend time in Asia, which I have not, will tell you that the US is now far more popular in Vietnam than it is in South Korea. And my son has been to Vietnam, and I know other young people who have been to Vietnam, and to Vietnamese today, particularly young Vietnamese, this is like the Civil War for us. Well, actually, it's probably further away than the Civil War for us, but that's not the story. And in fact, I got a question in the ILC from the Vietnamese officer when I lectured on Vietnam, and the first thing he said was, "I want you to know I'm so sick of hearing about this war." So yeah, I mean, well, obviously it's easier to be a generous winner, as the Vietnamese are, really, towards us, than to be in continued dependence like the South Koreans are. Yeah. Yes.
Good morning, sir. Captain Will Stubbs, U.S. Navy. I was struck in reading Schultzinger's Chapter 1 about how close we were to having a great friend in Vietnam in 1946, and what an enormous opportunity we missed to bring Ho Chi Minh into the family by embracing the Declaration of Independence, as it were, and helping them cast off French colonialism. It was almost it was almost tragic. Then you read Undersecretary Ball's report from 1964. Counterfactual. If Undersecretary Ball had been the president rather than Lyndon Johnson, was there another opportunity perhaps to switch allegiance right there and to turn a potential awful situation of declining situation into a friend, and perhaps be, basically flip a communist by turning him into a nationalist ally?
Well, to begin with, and this is the point of my book, American Tragedy, you don't need to go to the limit of the counterfactual of George Ball being president. You could just take the easier counterfactual of John Kennedy remaining president. And I disagree with Schultzinger about that. My book came out a few years after his. I'm not sure I would have changed his mind, though, but anyway. All we had to do, you see, the NLF and the North Vietnamese were not fighting officially for a unified Vietnam. That certainly was their goal, but they were fighting for an American withdrawal and a coalition government in South Vietnam. And there were many South Vietnamese who wanted that too in early 1965. And all we needed to do was agree to that. And that's roughly what Kennedy had done in Laos. You see, the thing that's caused so much confusion is that Kennedy died without knowing how bad the situation was in South Vietnam. And he only faced problems as they arose. And that problem hadn't arisen yet, as far as he knew. But yes, we certainly couldn't have done that. And in fact, the thing that made me shiver doing the research for my book was reading the press. You see, Johnson, he basically decided on the war in early December '64, in principle. But then he wanted to delay the beginning as long as possible to get as much legislation through Congress as he could before it happened. And so there's a period in January, February, where it looks as if we're really going to let it go. And in terms of the public reaction, it just looks like one huge sigh of relief. And then suddenly we start bombing and the Marines land in Da Nang. So yes, I don't think there's any question but that option was open. And as I say, we were scoring points in other parts of the world, and even in Southeast Asia. Of course, the Indonesian thing, to be fair, we started the war in the spring of '65. The military coup in Indonesia, the fall of Sukarno, was 6 months later. So we didn't know that was going to happen. But yeah, I think that opportunity was definitely open, but it wasn't the consensus position. No more questions. Well, hang on. Are there any more questions? I don't see anybody. All right. As many of you know, this is my final lecture as a full-time S&P faculty member after 22 years. And I'm going to allow myself a final word about the enterprise in which we are engaged in. And since I am never shy about admitting that somebody else said something better than I could have ever said it, I'm going to return once again to the master. And I'll give you a minute to read that. Okay. I have been a part of the American military in a non-combatant role for 6 years in the 1970s and now for the last 22 years. And what is your role in the world? Well, I would suggest that ultimately we have militaries and we maintain militaries for the same kind of reason that we have lawyers and doctors. That is, to deal with problems, which hopefully are occasional problems, that get in the way of our living a normal life. When we are sick, we need a doctor. When we need to draw up a binding contract or settle a dispute, we need a lawyer. Sometimes nations need to fight a war, and then we need you. But no one can live endlessly sick, endlessly in legal conflict, or endlessly at war. It is the premise of civilization that the normal state is peace. Now, it is difficult to apply this quote to the conflicts I've been talking about in the Third World, because these were not cases involving great and decisive actions. They were, by their nature, indecisive, and that makes life more difficult. And the same is true of the conflicts in which we are involved today. But that does not change our basic problem. We need to embed military action in a series of events, a chain of events leading, within a reasonably short period at least, to peace. And this is going to require, I think, in dealing with our current predicament, a superior level of strategic calculation, perhaps, than we have been able to show so far. Vietnam had another highly significant event, as I already mentioned. It started the strategy and policy course 40 years ago under Stansfield Turner. And it's been a great privilege for me to try to contribute to the development of more effective strategic thinking over 2 decades. And now we face problems that need answers and new answers. The United States and the world need peace. And if we cannot find a way to greater peace, we will be letting down our countrymen. We will be letting down the world, which inevitably depends on the wisdom of the world's strongest power, the United States. And last, but hardly least, we will be letting down you and the men and women who serve under you and all your families. So, as you go off into the world to turn your attention to problems from the tactical level on up, I wish you the best of luck in that great, quintessentially American task, so movingly defined in my youth by presidents like Kennedy and Johnson, and yes, even Nixon, of making the world a better and a safer place in which to live. Thank you very much.